In the fall of 1811, the first steamer operating in western waters left Pittsburgh. It departed for the same city to which it owed its name, New Orleans. The Allegheny River's position at the headwaters of North America's largest river basin made it the gateway to the west and the rapidly industrializing markets developing within the Mississippi watershed. Pittsburgh and its downstream peers of Cincinnati and Louisville grew as traffic down, and now, thanks to new steamboats up, the river expanded. The United States was colonizing the West, and that demanded a whole host of staple goods. Flour, pork, cider, and all manner of foodstuffs produced and processed upstream found a ready market farther down the river. It's difficult to capture the transformational nature of steam shipping on commerce in the Mississippi Basin. In 1814, the total tonnage of steamboats arriving in New Orleans was 2,098 tons. 7 years later, in 1821, it was 54,120. That's an increase of 2,600%. As the tributary with the greatest proximity to the industrialized core of the Mid-Atlantic, the Allegheny Valley and Pittsburgh in particular played a pivotal role in this transformation. According to the 1838 Louisville Directory, of the roughly 400 steamboats in service along the river, 112 were built in Pittsburgh. I'll get more into the local factors contributing to Pittsburgh's industrial ascendancy later, but the relevant part here is that the end of the Allegheny River marked the beginning of the American West. Zooming back into the Allegheny itself, its character was quite distinct from the larger Ohio and Mississippi. For most of the 1800s, the bottom 123 miles of the river between Franklin and Pittsburgh were navigable for small steamers only 6 months of the year when flows were high enough. Protruding rock formations, hairpin turns, unstable shoals, and narrow spans prevented the river from receiving heavier boat traffic. Instead, much of the freight transported along the Allegheny traveled via barges floating on the current and small flatboats pulled by horses from the riverbank. The latter method was commonly used to transport heavier loads, such as limestone, paving stones, and milling stones from quarries along the Allegheny's tributaries. According to the 1879 survey of the Allegheny River conducted by the War Department, however, the largest component of the river's traffic wasn't dug up, but cut down. Quote, "The chief commodity of commerce on the Allegheny River is, doubtless, lumber. Immense quantities of lumber came down every spring in rafts from its headwaters, augmented by others from the Clarion, Red Bank, Mahoning, and Kiskiminetas rivers. Harvesting mostly pine and hemlock, the forestry industry of the Allegheny watershed was vital for feeding construction downstream." Significantly, that same report also notes that the timber trade had actually peaked back in the 1840s and had been in decline ever since. Why were fewer trees being cut down? There just weren't as many of them left. In 1876, the State Board of the Centennial Managers reported that, quote, "The state, Pennsylvania, is heavily timbered and that many years must elapse before its forest will disappear." On the local level, it was a different story. The report prefaced that optimism with a stark declaration. Quote, "A large part of the Allegheny Valley has been almost denuded of its pine forests." The biosphere of the Allegheny watershed experienced intense stressors during the intensification and industrialization of human settlement in the valley. The most visible transformation was that of the forest, or lack thereof. Drought, fire, and severe storm conditions caused major damage in the 18th century, and exploitation in the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, depleted much of the remaining virgin and second-growth forests. Those living in the 19th century were by no means ignorant of the implications. According to engineer Thomas P. Roberts, in 1878, quote, "Clearing the forest lands, I believe, is followed by greater fluctuations in our river. I think the storm waters undoubtedly reach the streams more rapidly now than formerly, and thus may be affecting the increase in the width of the riverbeds observed so frequently in the West. With less vegetative ground cover and less precipitation infiltrating the soil, the watershed lost a principal mechanism for moderating runoff." Roberts' report also notes more severe erosion, with banks shifting and islands disappearing as more extreme events swept away sediment at increasing rates. Degradation of the forest and riparian habitats likely affected native animal life. In 1909, Dr. A.E. Ortman, curator of invertebrate zoology at the Carnegie Museum, published the report, "The Destruction of the Freshwater Fauna in Western Pennsylvania." Ortman saw documenting and preserving the species of the Allegheny watershed as his life's work. Referring to himself in the third person, he grimly reported that, quote, "In many cases his efforts were in vain, and life had entirely disappeared in many streams." Ortman then goes on to outline a typical succession of disappearance as the health of a stream declines. First to go are the mussels. Once they are gone for good. Second, freshwater fish begin to disappear, but they can reappear during high water periods. Next to go are the crawfish, then the gastropods. Fifth are the aquatic reptiles like snakes and turtles. Finally, Ortman identifies the muskrat as the most resilient organism to degradation of the river ecosystems, as they are not dependent on aquatic food. He cites 3 primary drivers of population decline. First, increasing hunting and fishing. As the population of the valley increased, nutritional pressure led to increasingly unsustainable practices. Second, dams constructed in the century prior were disrupting migration and reproduction for aquatic species. While most intense in the tributaries of the Monongahela, Ortman's observations extended to the headwaters of the Allegheny as well. These stressors alone, however, could only depress wildlife populations, not destroy them. In cases of complete ecological collapse, he puts the blame squarely on pollution. While it was commonplace for sewage to run off or be directly discharged into the river system throughout the century prior, Ortman claims a marginal ecological impact. The truly destructive contamination came from fossil fuel extraction. The coal, oil, and natural gas industries each contributed to the abysmal water quality through multiple pathways. Coal mines and coking plants leached highly acidic chemicals into streams, wreaking havoc on the biosphere. This mine water could easily be recognized by its distinct bluish-green color and accompanying rust-red deposits on the stream floor. From the various point sources across the Allegheny's headwaters, tributaries delivered pollutants into the lower basin. Quote, "Kiskimneneta's River, at the point of union with the Allegheny, is in a fearful condition, pollution consisting chiefly of mine water from the extensive coal regions of Westmoreland, Indiana, Cambria, and Somerset counties. Oil and natural gas production proved even more destructive. Not only did refineries discharge chemicals hostile to aquatic life and crude spill directly into waterways, but well sites regularly pumped salt water out of the ground. Salt infiltration degraded the surface and groundwater of well sites with knock-on effects on the wider watershed." Describing the effects of the oil city of Franklin on the biosphere of the Allegheny River, Ortman reported that, quote, "For 40 miles and more below there is not a mussel, not a crawfish, not a fish able to live in this water." Combined with the additional pollutants introduced from glass factories, chemical plants, and wood pulp mills, Ortman's final prognosis for the watersheds of western Pennsylvania was grim. Quote, "Unless we improve the quality of the water of our rivers, it is impossible to bring back the original condition of their fauna. In attempts to restore our natural resources with regard to the fish fauna by restocking our polluted streams with fish will be labor and money thrown away." Okay, I've buried the lead long enough. It's time to discuss the role of fossil fuels in the industrialization of the Allegheny Valley.